So welcome everyone to this webinar on e-resource licensing explained, an A to Z guidebook for libraries. Um, let's get started with introductions from our authors, and then we'll say a few words of introduction, and then you'll a few welcoming remarks, and then you'll hear from the authors. So Sandra, did you want to kick us off with introductions?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Aya Inamil, and I am the Director of Scholarly Communication and Collection Strategy at Yale Library. Should I say the next person? Katie?
Sure. I'm Katie Zimmerman. I'm the Director of Copyright Strategy at the MIT Libraries. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Sandberg. I'm the Director of Scholarly Communication and Information Policy at UC Berkeley Library. And I will turn it over to Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha Teramy, and I'm the licensing librarian at UC Berkeley Library. And I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Samantha. My name is Eric Limpitlaw. I'm the Digital Collections Licensing Librarian at Stanford University.
Awesome. Thank you all. And I'm Catherine Klosek, Director of Information Policy and Federal Relations at the Association of Research Libraries, ARL. Before we dive in, I want to mention that you should have access to the Q&A function in Zoom. And so if you do have questions or comments for the authors, please use that function, and we'll save time for Q&A at the end here. I know we're excited to hear from the authors, but I just wanted to say a bit about ARL's interest in this resource. I think the authors first shared, that they're writing this book about a year ago, last January, and I was really excited to hear about it because obviously it's going to be a really great, resource for ARL members and the larger library licensing community, and sort of a resource for our ongoing exploration of the issue of contractual override. And will really help libraries in understanding and taking action on preserving library and researcher rights in the face of restrictive contract terms. And I mentioned in the book's forward that these authors have really demonstrated how licensing can help achieve public policy priorities and goals, including improving accessibility for people with disabilities, and of course ensuring that researchers can access and use works. And we'll hear more about those examples as we go throughout. So that's just a little bit about ARL's interest in publishing this book, but I know we're here to hear from the authors. So I'm going to kick it off with a question for Rachel. Rachel, please tell us a bit about the book and how it's going to help libraries negotiate for computational research rights.
Sure. So we believe that the role of law is increasingly important in libraries. If you are doing digitization of your special collections and want to provide online access, you're thinking about copyright, contracts, privacy, and ethics. All of the publishing agreements that your authors sign with publishers that can shape their rights as authors. Your authors are conducting text and data mining, and they are working within a very highly regulated landscape and need to understand what their legal rights are. But electronic resource licensing is sort of top of our list in terms of the impact of law on the work of the library and its universality across research libraries. E-resource licensing is challenging. We recognize that it involves complex areas of law, complex issues across many different areas of law. So for example, as Catherine mentioned, e-resource licensing has to address accessibility law. So does the content come in a format that is accessible for your users? You have to address privacy law. Do your scholars' use of publisher platforms or services place user privacy at risk? Copyright law, of course, what can your scholars do with the works that you're licensing? Can they download them? Can they share them? Can they mine them? What else can they do with them? And of course, general contractual obligations. So for instance, what exposure does your library face if you're sued for the acts undertaken by your users? Or do you want to preclude being sued for the acts being undertaken by your users? What warranties do you need a publisher to make? Or what rights of indemnification for the library do you want to preserve? So within all of these many types of areas of law that emerge in e-resource licensing, computational research presents a particularly important and evolving concern that, at least for me, was the impetus in getting our ducks in a row and organizing to write this book. We have written elsewhere why training AI tools, particularly in scholarly and research contexts, constitutes a fair use under US copyright law. And the problem that US scholarly authors presently face with AI training is that publishers restrict their access to these statutory rights through contracts, the e-resource agreements, that can override these statutory rights. That is to say, in the United States, publishers can use private contracts to take away statutory fair use rights that researchers would otherwise hold under federal law. This is the contractual override situation that Catherine mentioned in her opening remarks. Even if you preserve fair use in your e-resource license agreement with a fair use savings clause, if that is later followed by a more specific clause in the agreement that prohibits or restricts AI training, for example, then fair uses of AI are overridden or restricted. So contractual override of fair use is a problem here, but it is also a problem that disparately disadvantages US researchers. As we talk about in the book, more than 40 countries, including the European Union, expressly reserve text and data mining and AI training rights for scientific research conducted by research institutions. So not only do scholars in these countries not have to worry about whether their computational research with AI is permitted, but also they don't have to risk having those rights overridden by contract. The European Union's Copyright and Digital Single Market Directive and its recent AI Act nullify any attempt to take away or circumscribe the text and data mining and the AI training rights reserved for scientific research within research organizations. Unfortunately, US scholars are not as fortunate, and this problem is emblematic of the contractual override problem more broadly. So negotiating to preserve these rights in US agreements is really challenging in terms of labor and legal understanding. Katie's going to be talking to you about that today. We really wanted to help people out in thinking about how to negotiate and preserve these rights for scholars. We know that understanding the law is really important for e-resource licensing, but who is actually teaching licensing librarians what the law is? We felt that this area is really underserved in terms of training and education. Of course, the co-authors and I have each been engaged in training new librarians around how to read and understand contracts, how to interpret terms, how to edit and revise agreements, and basically everything you can learn about contractual rights and remedies that we learned in law school. But that's not really scalable. The reason why we've had to each engage in undertakings like this is because there isn't really a comprehensive guide to understanding the legal terms of electronic resource agreements for librarians who lack a legal background, or even skilled e-resource librarians who maybe never really knew all of the important considerations within a given term. So there's a lot of great work that's out there on managing e-resources and phenomenal work on the act of how to negotiate licenses, but very little on what the terms of the license actually mean. So we pulled together as authors a group of people who have the legal expertise, and we decided to go clause by clause through an e-resource agreement, pulling together practical guidance on what they mean and what you're looking for what we think is the first time. And actually, Catherine, Sandra, Katie, and I began discussing this in January 2023, and we started to poke around a little bit on our own, off and on, for about a year, but we really had no time to devote or discipline to do it. So in January 2024, when ARL came on board as a publisher, we really got down to business, expanded the writing team with Eric and Samantha, and in just under a year, cranked everything out.
Thanks, Rachel. You and your co-authors have emphasized that this is a practical guide about how to license for computational research and other functions. Katie, can you talk us through kind of just how the book works and the value it'll have for computational research and researchers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best way to do this, I think, is to look at an example. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is an example of a clause you might see. This is a model clause. This is from the CDL model license. And this is super helpful. This is, this is a very good starting point for, you need to add text and data mining into a contract. Here's a clause that will do the things that you want, the way that you want them. If you can get this in as it is, then great. But this isn't actually what you need our book for. The model licenses are already out there. There's a lot of great resources out there like model licenses. Annotated model licenses are out there. But the thing that the gap that we identified is the things that get you to negotiate past this point. So if you can get this language in as it is, that's great. But if you need to adapt it, if you need to work with it, then you may need a little bit more guidance, and that's what we're trying to provide with the book. So next slide. So you may start out with something that looks a little bit more like this, and this is just an arbitrary example, and it's kind of okay. It says the licensee and the authorized users can use the content for scientific text and data mining projects. Okay, great. That says what you need it to, but then it says the licensed content downloaded for this purpose shall be deleted at the conclusion of a TDM research project. And that's probably a little bit more problematic. That doesn't match the standard practice that researchers are going to need when they're doing this sort of project. They're generally going to need to be able to retain the content, at least in a private capacity, for validation and replication purposes. And so a hard deletion requirement like this is not going to be super workable. So one thing that the book does is explain that so that in terms that are useful for the licensing librarian, and also that can be used to explain why we're asking for these things to vendors. And next slide. And this is what the next step of negotiating this clause might look like. So you might adapt it to, instead of saying content is going to be deleted at the end of the project, content is going to be deleted once it's no longer needed. So if maybe you got more in that initial download than you ended up actually including in your final data set, for example. But once it's no longer needed, except as necessary for those necessary research functions. So that's model language that's in there. If you need it, you can adapt it to your purposes. And maybe the vendor comes back from this and says, okay, well, that's all right, but this is still a large quantity of text, and we still have some security concerns. So go ahead to the next slide. So you might end up adding in this sentence as well, just to clarify that everything is still subject to the terms of the agreement, and the content is still going to be protected as is otherwise described in the agreement. So that's just kind of a short, quick example of what we hope the book helps you to do as a licensing librarian. Yeah, so that you have the tools you need to negotiate and adjust language.
Thanks for those examples, Katie. Samantha, we've talked a little bit about licensing as a way to achieve library mission and public policy objectives. Can you share an example of how you've been able to advance your library's mission through licensing?
Sure. So one of the major licensing endeavors that we've been working on is to increase the accessibility of our e-resources as part of our university's equity and inclusion goals. Since the new ADA Title II ruling, this has become a matter of ensuring that we're compliant with federal regulations, but we've actually been advocating for stronger accessibility language in our licenses for a couple of years now in an effort to hopefully push the publishing world towards born accessible materials. So for example, typically most libraries will ask for a VPAT during licensing to determine the resource's level of compliance. And then if necessary, the library or the disability office will make modifications based on the needs of its users. At Berkeley, we've been trying to go a step further by placing the onus on vendors and publishers to make sure their resources are accessible when we receive them, which eliminates the work of having to make reasonable modifications after the fact. It also helps us to avoid liability on the campus's end, as we've established that it's the vendor's responsibility to provide us with accessible materials and that we're not purchasing non-accessible materials if we can help it. So to place the onus on vendors, we've started using new language in our contracts that asks for a warranty or representation that the vendor is compliant with both California state and federal accessibility laws, as well as the Web Content and Access Guidelines, or WCAG. We also ask for a representation that the vendor will make reasonable efforts to solve any accessibility issues that do happen to arise. What we've started doing that's a little bit newer is we've gone down to the warranty disclaimer section of the contract as well, where you'll usually find language that says something along the lines of, the vendor disclaims all warranties and provides the licensed materials as is. So we've started adding language that prohibits the vendor from disclaiming the accessibility warranty that they just provided by adding except with express warranties, or except with respect to express warranties, in front of those statements so that they cannot disclaim the warranty that they've just given us about accessibility. Similarly, we then apply the same statement in the indemnification section. The contract will usually say vendor shall not be held liable for any damages, which we then amend to say, except with respect to any express warranties, vendor shall not be held liable for any damages. By adding this, if the university gets sued based on accessibility claims, then there are already contractual terms established that would have the vendor indemnify us and would shift that legal responsibility onto the vendor. This also helps the university with potential PR issues that may arise from an accessibility lawsuit, as we can point to our efforts to work with vendors that have specifically promised to provide accessible materials when we entered the agreement. We found that the vast majority of vendors have been very accepting of new contract language with very little negotiation involved. Occasionally, smaller vendors won't accept certain parts of the accessibility warranty, like agreeing to California state law if they're in a different state, but we'll narrow down their concern to ensure that we get an accessibility representation that's agreeable for both parties. So it's been encouraging to see such willingness from vendors to provide born accessible materials, and we've tried to share our language with as many colleagues and other institutions as possible to hopefully push this agenda of born accessible materials as far as possible. And hopefully this book will work to spread the word a little bit more.
Thanks, Samantha. That's awesome work that you all are doing. And I wanted to just pause a moment. I shared a blog post that Rachel co-authored in the chat that describes the contractual override problems that we heard a little bit about, and then a resource that includes the language and strategies that Samantha just described as well. And a reminder, thanks for those who are using the Q&A function to add your questions. Keep them coming. We're going to keep hearing from the authors, and then we'll turn it over to questions. So Sandra, I think our group here would love to hear from you on kind of the biggest challenge you experience when licensing e-resources, and any guidance you have for libraries when negotiating licenses that support computational research.
Thank you, Catherine. So as many of you who are on the call who deal with these issues every day or get called in to discuss some of these issues, one of the things that that's happening more and more increasingly is we have researchers, we have students who are coming forward and they want to have access to e-resources, licensed resources, and be able to use it for computational data research, data mining, and increasingly wanting to use it in artificial intelligence, and wanting to know like what are the possibilities for utilizing licensed research. At my institution, this is something we are encountering almost every day, where we have researchers who are interested and they want to know what they can and can't do, or they find out that they can't do something because maybe they've gotten dinged or their access has been cut off. And a lot of times when we're negotiating, we are trying our best. And again, I know that many people who are on the call are doing the same. You're trying your best to try to get the best deals for the researchers and stakeholders who may access these resources. But you're going against vendors, publishers who also are like very concerned about what's going to happen with the resources they have. They may not have all the rights that they need to be able to license things in such a way that might be helpful for our researchers. Or if they do, maybe they are thinking about how they could best create products that they could sell to us at another time, or how they want to best protect maybe some of the content for which they do have copyright or they've been given permission to make that work available. And so they're also trying to protect their product, protect their brands, and protect some of the rights holders and creations that they have. And so it's a complicated system because us in the library, we're also cognizant of that need, and but we also want to make sure there are things that are available to our researchers. So some of the things, like I've said, has been complicated to try to get permission and get the ability for our students or our faculty to be able to do analysis, to run AI, to use it for training, and to do all those things. But one thing that what I really appreciate about this guide is that we not only are talking about what's happening and what kinds of activity might be happening and what you would want to have it happen, but we also provide some examples of that. And so what has been very helpful to me in my journey is having these suggested clauses, which, maybe you try one and that doesn't work. Like Katie was giving the examples, you might go through and say, let's try this. They come back and they say no and redline it and go through and you say, let's try this. And because you have so many different examples or different ways you might want to approach it, you can come back and feel that you've made the best, even if you're not able to be successful, you've made your best effort at that. Something else that I've found to be successful recently, especially in talking about artificial intelligence, is because things are so unsettled at the moment, people are concerned, there's litigation happening, is that we've been able to successfully negotiate time-bound clauses where perhaps now they're saying it's a no for now, but they're willing to put in language and we're willing to agree to revisit if there is a determination or there's a decision that's made that perhaps this is, we have something that comes down that says this is fair use, or we have something that comes down that, maybe unfortunately is not in our favor, but still we are both negotiating in good faith to say we can come back in 2 years, we can come back in 1 year to look at what's happening in the landscape if there's a different understanding than there is now about artificial intelligence, and then we can come back and negotiate those clauses or negotiate for more or increased rights. And so I know that can often take a lot of time, in doing the work, but sometimes it does take a lot of time to do this and to get these outcomes. But in the end, it can be worth it for our researchers who are, just trying to work on, academic scholarship and doing research and doing really interesting things. And some of them are going to change the world. So we want to do our best to support them. So that's been my experience. And I know probably a lot of people on the call are having the same kinds of experiences. And I think the book will be helpful in giving them information and guidance, and most importantly, examples where they can feel empowered to, okay, that didn't work, let's try this other one.
I love that empowerment. That's awesome. And it's always, great to hear sort of the practical, on the ground examples. So thank you. And I guess kind of on that note, Eric, what advice do you have for librarians in our audience today?
Thank you, Catherine. I think in listening to the way Rachel introduced this topic and the number of available resources, I think it's really important to try to not let the lack of these resources act as a sign that it's either not important nor that education and training is not needed. In fact, I think it's truly just the opposite. And we can sort of get into our own rhythms and processes and not make room where there's a really uphill learning curve for a lot of this stuff. And so I have several basic things that I still try to incorporate into things that I would share as advice is to take the time to learn what we are signing. That same idea of trying to sign anything that you either don't understand or something that you really couldn't explain in plain language to a colleague. And this book, I think, will help you with that. It will be a quicker resource and a more commonly used resources where we can potentially start talking and using the same language to all of these publishers. And I think that sort of grassroots approach, we are starting to feel it, especially with the language that we've come up with regarding AI and carving out these small use cases that are now more acceptable at the beginning of a license, or maybe get to a point at the end. This is also a book with a lot of information. And so my suggestion and advice would be to take one section at a time. Maybe take a plan to go through it with your group, or have several people take different sections and respond back on maybe how you might be doing or incorporating or already incorporating things. I think this is a great opportunity to see where your successes are in the library and your negotiation, and where you might be lacking or need improvement, and then create sort of a process to adjust. Um, Learning to spot licensing issues and common legal issues will take time. So I think the important thing is that we're helping you identify what to talk about and what may or may not make sense. And then you can talk about it yourselves, um, in your library, but also in your negotiations. Um, One of the things too, this is still a base, this is a practical guide, it's a primer, it gives you foundations on the law. It should really empower everybody to feel comfortable talking about things. But there's still a lot of things we can continue to share. And I don't want that to impede the fact that we need to share our strategies with how we're dealing with large publishers, or how we're dealing with difficult passages. For example, I've started to work in a process where, when a vendor requires a new license, maybe it's been 10 years, asking them to summarize what the most important salient or material terms are for how it's going to impact your library and your users ahead of time is a shared responsibility that will save you time, and also create a very specific point of negotiation that you both have read this agreement. I think my final advice is that if you're spending time negotiating these new terms, that you carve out a space in those agreements where it expressly states that it will take priority over any conflicts with online terms or order forms that often just reference general uh, linkable terms, or end user license agreements that we're not often able to adjust because of the way they're embedded into programs. But we can do this at a time, and make sure that all of our efforts is not for nothing. Um, that's where I'm going to end.
Perfect. And I think that, thanks, Eric. And I think that sort of transitions us into a question around sort of, what do you see as the future of this project? And Rachel, maybe we'll cycle back to you.
Sure. So we did our best to get a good product to market as quickly as we could, with the understanding that because it is an open access ebook, it is also available print on demand for anyone who prefers print. You can, from our book page, it'll click you over to Amazon if you wanted to get a print on demand version. But because this is an open access ebook, we can continue to keep it current and fresh as strategies change, as our understanding of the law changes. So Sandra mentioned, there might be court rulings that shift our understanding of the contours of fair use. It's very easy for us to update the book to reflect that. We've been talking internally about how we might go about doing that. Do we update it quarterly? Reflect at the end of a chapter, the last time it was updated, or updates for a particular year. So we do have a local commitment to continuing to do that. We also, in the meantime, want to hear, even though this is version 1.0, we want to hear from you about where it does or doesn't meet your needs. We do, before you switch slides, Catherine, Catherine's going to show you an email address that you can write to us at. And I just want to caution you that it is our we have very good intentions of reading your suggestions and comments. We cannot promise that we will monitor that email account. There is a place to reach out, and we will do our best to review everything. But it isn't something that we can absolutely guarantee that we'll be able to review and respond to. And I also want to suggest that this is specifically about the book, suggestions about the book, and not to write to us with, okay, so the publisher is doing this and I'm suggesting this, what do you recommend? that's not something we can take on. Before I turned it over to Sandra to say just a little bit more about other next steps, I just wanted to mention one thing, which is we've framed this book as going clause by clause, understanding exactly what the law says, what model language there is, and what tips and tricks you can use to improve the language you might get from a publisher, or traps to watch out for. That is great and very helpful for you as you're negotiating agreements, but it is also really important to understand contracts at a much broader level. When is there a contract? If you're having a bunch of back and forth email exchanges with the publisher, have you entered into an agreement with that? It is entirely possible. You want to make sure that your final agreement is, takes precedent over all of these other email exchanges. So we've created appendices. So far, you'll have basic rules of contract in Appendix A, where we cover contract formation, contract interpretation, contract breach. How do you know if a contract has been breached? And what the remedies are for breach of contract, as well as whether or not some other types of commercial laws apply to contract interpretation and negotiation for your e-resource agreements. So our goal is, we've started with Appendix A, which gives you a foundation without having gone to, without your having gone to law school, on basic rules of contract. We fully intend to continue to expand the number of appendices with other basics and exercises that would enhance your understanding of other aspects of e-resource negotiation. And I will turn it over to Sandra now.
Thanks, Rachel. So when we first started talking about doing this book, it was really because Rachel kind of reached out and was like, is there a thing that just basically goes through these steps? And we were like, that's a need. And we definitely knew that we wanted it to be something that would be openly available for people to be able to get access to. But one of the things that we also talked about was the fact that this could be something that's like a living document that could be updated from time to time, that we could easily update from time to time, and that we would be able to be engaged and be in community with other folks who are doing this work, other projects that are also doing work that's in alignment. And one of those projects that we wanted to definitely call out and partner with, and we've had one conversation, but we definitely think there'll be opportunities for more, are Scarlett and Catherine from the Open Negotiation Education and Academic Libraries project, which some of you may be familiar with or had some involvement with. I'm going to drop that link and for information in the chat. And they are dealing with negotiation issues, which is definitely very much connected and in alignment with the work that we're doing, and trying to help people feel that they are getting like up to speed and more information about how to negotiate and have essentially what you need to do to get the terms that you want or that you can live with in these agreements that we are all operating under in our various places within the library. And so we are looking also to partner with other obvious and maybe not obvious projects and folks who are doing work who will be interested in partnering with us as well. So I think that email address will be shared. So definitely send something out there. We, as Rachel mentioned, it won't be actively monitored. But we definitely will be checking it, and we'll want to communicate with anybody who wants to partner and wants to connect with us, and people who want to link to the work. Please feel free to do that. Please definitely share it widely, share it within your institution and with other folks who do this work who may not have had an opportunity to join this call. One thing I just want to just say, second Rachel's comment about not having legal advice. So if you have a very specific scenario or situation, that email is not the place to put that in. I would definitely recommend that you maybe talk to general counsel, or maybe you could hit us up individually to ask questions, but that email will probably not be the place for that. So.
Thank you. With all the caveats from Rachel and Sandra, here's the email address, and we're gonna dive into Q&A. Again, please use the Q&A function of the webinar. And I also want to note that we'll send this recording and slides and links after the webinar.